curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers, explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Greetings and welcome to All Things Policy podcast of the Takshashila Institution. I'm your host Abhishek Kadiyala, a research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program studying the US. Our guest today is Professor Paul McGarr, a distinguished scholar in intelligence studies and a lecturer at King's College London's prestigious War Studies department. He has written and published extensively on the intelligence of the US, the UK, with a strong focus on intelligence and geopolitics of the Indian subcontinent as well. His latest work, Spying in South Asia, deals with this often lesser discussed aspect of the Indo-US intelligence relations. Welcome to the podcast, Professor McGarr. It's an honor to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Abhishek. It's lovely to be on the podcast. I'm delighted to be invited, so thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think we'll directly get into the basics. So for our audience, so today what we'll be discussing mainly is the US intelligence community in relation to India, right? So we will start by, I want to ask you about the overall structure of US intelligence community. How does it operates at a structural level, and also, the more functional aspects of it?
Sure. So I guess, as with most intelligence communities globally, the United States intelligence community is a sort of product of failure, really, in many respects. So it really begins quite late in the day. So where British intelligence, for example, can trace its origins back to 1909, when MI6, British external intelligence, and MI5, British internal intelligence, are sort of created in 1909 off the back of threats perceived to be coming from Imperial Germany around the sort of beginning of the 20th century. So quite a long history, over 100 years old. American intelligence really traces its sort of formalized links really to 1947 with the National Security Act under the Truman administration, which formalizes, brings into parity the National Security Council, but also the Central Intelligence Agency, the sort of the apex agency really for American intelligence for so long. And that National Security Act in 1947 is really a product of intelligence failure, and it's the failure of 1941 and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor when it caught the US Pacific Fleet by surprise, and the sort of, was the genesis for the beginning of the Second World War in the Asia Pacific region, really. So from that point onwards, in 1947, the United States intelligence community begins to develop and evolve in interesting ways. But really, the Central Intelligence Agency is the apex, the premier organization in American intelligence, really from that point onwards, certainly in external intelligence terms. The FBI predated the CIA, but it had been a very sort of insular, domestically focused intelligence service, and really, really police-based, not really as an intelligence service as we would now know it, really. So from 1947 onwards, the United States begins to really become a major global power in external intelligence. And it's not until I think we get to another major intelligence failure, which your listeners will be unsurprised to know happened on 9/11 in the United States back in 2001, where a huge intelligence failure with the attack on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. Again, a big commission happens after the 9/11 attacks, and that intelligence commission basically calls for a complete reorganization of American intelligence. The core finding of that commission is American intelligence has been siloed. It hasn't been speaking to each other. There's enough information to at least preempt those attacks, if not prevent them. And that information hasn't been communicated within the intelligence community in the United States satisfactorily. So big congressional inquiry, and what comes out of that is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So again, another apex organization is formed in the United States. The ODNI, or the Office for the Development of National Intelligence. That process really now galvanizes American intelligence. So we have a system where the apex organization is no longer the Central Intelligence Agency, it's the ODNI. But that, I think, has been problematic since 2002 or 2004 when it really comes in. Because the ODNI is as an apex organization, but it doesn't have tremendous power over the constituent parts of the American intelligence community. So there are 18 major intelligence organizations in the United States that range from the CIA, the FBI, military intelligence, State Department's own intelligence bureau, all the way down to the US Coast Guard has its own intelligence function. So it's quite a diverse and fractured intelligence community. And the ODNI was supposed to come in to coordinate that, but it doesn't really have tremendous amounts of power. So it doesn't really have power over how those agencies, who they appoint or how they're structured or the mission they're tasked with. So for example, the Pentagon's military intelligence reports into the Department of Defense and Defense Secretary. The State Department's intelligence function still reports into the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. So we have these principals in the United States who are still really in charge of their own intelligence fiefdoms, if you like. So the ODNI reforms have been useful to some extent, but still limited in terms of what they're able to do, really. So I would say the United States intelligence at the moment, incredibly large, incredibly diverse, lots of different agencies, a huge global remit, a huge global budget. I mean, if we strip out military intelligence from that budget, we're still talking about an annual budget of something of the order of $66 billion. If you feed intelligence into that, you're talking 100 billion plus. So it's a huge budget. It's a huge sort of monolithic organization, really. But in terms of tasking and what it actually achieves, it's still a little bit fractured, I think, in terms of how it plays out. And its culture is very different, I think. I think maybe in India and the United Kingdom, if we're thinking about intelligence cultures, they're much more similar. So I think the sort of the culture of Indian intelligence and certainly British intelligence is a culture of consensus. So the Joint Intelligence Committee, which I know India has as well, is really about trying to get intelligence agencies to come together and agree on a common threat and agree on a common policy to handle that threat, really. So it's very consensual in its approach before it gets to individuals like prime ministers, etc. But in the United States, it's much more adversarial. You get intelligence agencies competing against each other with very different sort of opinions on, for example, Iran's nuclear program. The Pentagon intelligence agencies may think one way, the CIA may think another. It's a sort of much more adversarial system, really. So in that sense, it's a different sort of intelligence culture.
I think one takeaway I would also like to mention that because when I asked the question, I asked you to mention both structural and functional aspects of it. And it was really nice how you rounded up it in the end regarding the functional aspect of it, because it translates into the sort of structures. They establish some kind of checks and balances in intelligence community, but the function is that in the end, they lack that sense of coordination in U.S. intelligence community, right? So let me take you back to the latest intelligence failure in that sense, that is the 9/11. Do you think it has in turn led to a situation? I mean, not only 9/11, but the following Bush administration reforms that focuses on, like surveillance, lack of privacy, and that kind of angle to laws that comes about, that is also interlinked with intelligence community. Do you think these events and the events that followed after that cultivated a sense of skepticism among common public regarding the U.S. intelligence community that eventually also led to the rise of, the MAGA movement at Trump?
Yeah, I think intelligence, the events of the horrific events of 9/11 had positive impacts on the US intelligence community, but also some negative impacts on the US intelligence community as well. It's certainly fueled conspiracism, and it's fueled this notion of the deep state in the United States. So the notion of a deep state, a sort of state within a state that's controlling the democratic institutions of the United States is nothing new. It's been there for hundreds of years in the United States. So this is something that's always been in the background. But I think at various points in American history, and particularly at times of intense tension and stress within the American democratic system, those fault lines around deep state and conspiracism really come to the fore. So if we think about, in an earlier example, maybe John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas in 1963, and the deep state and conspiracy theories that came out of that in the 1960s that were really fueled by no real evidence to support them, but they gained traction in the United States. Similar sort of thing happens after 9/11. I think that the MAGA movement think, well, the United States is so powerful, it's omnipotent. Surely someone must have been working on the inside to make this happen. It couldn't just been a terrorist organization. They wouldn't have the capability. So again, no evidence to support those conspiracy theories, absolutely. And they've been, I think, quite comprehensively debunked over time. But they gain traction within certain elements of right-wing communities in the United States, and Donald Trump has certainly played off those. And interesting, Donald Trump has always been a quite skeptical sort of person or president when it comes to intelligence. Some presidents are very, very close to the intelligence community. They value what the intelligence community can offer them in terms of national security advice. Other presidents are deeply skeptical about the intelligence community. And certainly Trump falls into that category where he's deeply skeptical, I think, particularly of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's probably akin to Richard Nixon, maybe in the 1970s, who had a very troubled relationship with India, of course, but also had a very troubled relationship with American intelligence and regarded American intelligence as out to do him down, out to subvert his presidency, sort of anti-Nixon in many senses. Again, no evidence to support that whatsoever, but paranoia in Nixon, I think, is really mirrored in Trump. And his sort of approach to American intelligence is very much I think mainly centered on Russia and Putin and sort of the links that have been established in some elements of the American intelligence community between Vladimir Putin's attempts to try and influence the American election in 2016. So Trump personalizes that sort of information, regards it as a personal attack on him as an individual, rather than seeing it as a more structural attack by Russia on the United States and its democratic institutions. So I think that's been problematic for the United States. But yeah, 9/11, I think, has fueled that sense of conspiracism. It's been very positive in many ways. I think the ODNI experiment has taken time to actually gain traction, but it's beginning to show that it is important to have an overarching process of coordination within the American system, which I think most commentators agreed was too fractured, too diverse, and there were holes in which terrorists could push through and threaten the United States. And some of those have been addressed now. It also just like really simple things like an American intelligence community that had become quite narrow in its focus, quite lazy. So even if we think about basic stuff like linguistics, very few speakers who covered Central and Southern Asian languages in the Central Intelligence Agency at that point. So just thinking about where the threat might emanate from and how the CIA would engage with that threat in a constructive way, I think are really interesting. So developing linguistic and cultural skills that the agency simply didn't have preceding 9/11. I think one of the biggest issues, though, is politicization. And you mentioned Bush and Trump. And I think since 2003, particularly with the war in Iraq, there has been a skepticism and a cynicism that's crept into the American public as more and more disclosures have come out on the politicization of intelligence. So the case made for the war in Iraq in 2003 around weapons of mass destruction and how that case was just fell apart really in 2004 and 2005 as the UN survey groups found no evidence of Iraq having a WMD capability or a program even at that point. So I think there is a skepticism that intelligence agencies have been sort of politicized by their masters in the White House to just deliver intelligence that they want to. And I think that has really seeped into American popular culture now. And it's not helped by Donald Trump's second term. I mean, if we just think about the recent American bombing attack on Iran's nuclear program, and how that topped in controversy around Tulsi Gabbard saying earlier this year that actually Iran wasn't developing a nuclear weapons program, that they hadn't made much progress in terms of nuclear weapons development. And then once Trump decides to bomb Iran, Tulsi Gabbard has to make a complete 180 U-turn and say, actually, no, my assessment was wrong. We think there is compelling evidence. So I think everyone in the American public sees that this is being sort of politicized to some extent. And I think that one of the worst things I think any intelligence officer will say is it's absolutely important not to politicize intelligence. Intelligence needs to be able to speak truth to power. So Donald Trump needs to hear the unvarnished truth from his intelligence agencies. I think there's a sense within the United States intelligence community that increasingly that capacity to speak truth to power is being corroded and eroded under the Trump administration. And that benefits no one. And it certainly imperils, I think, American national security in the long term. So yeah, worrying trends, I think, at the moment.
So another interesting aspect of it is, Trump's overall relationship with the intelligence committee in terms of the allegations on him as well, right? The entire Russian collusion discussion that's going on, and the larger things associated with him. The Hillary Clinton files closely linked with the FBI again, and a similar kind of case that happens on him. Him taking his documents to Mar-a-Lago, and I think that eventually led to some kind of rivalry at a personal level between Trump and the community in that sense. But one question I would also like to ask in that sense is that, when the first Trump administration came, the major demand and then the major electoral point on which he campaigned also was draining the swamp, right? Draining the swamp in the Washington, D.C. obviously means lobbyists, but in terms of foreign policy and intelligence, it means also, they also involve strong lobbyist influence. And it also involves some kind of stronghold that intelligence community bureaucracy has on the policymaking process at large. So why is Trump administration more willing to move into attacking intelligence community more freely today than it was back in the first Trump administration? What do you think are the differences between his approach?
Yeah, I think it's a consistent direction of travel. So I don't think Trump, for example, has completely changed tack on the intelligence community. As we discussed previously, I think Trump has always harbored a deep sense of skepticism towards the Central Intelligence Agency. During his first term, that was clearly evident. If we go back to thinking about 2018, when during Trump's first term, where he met with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, and they met for a summit. And the world was aghast, really, when Trump appeared to be defending Putin, when Putin was saying that Russia hadn't interfered or at least attempted to interfere in the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. So we've got a huge weight of evidence from the Central Intelligence Agency, from the FBI, from other intelligence agencies inside the United States saying Russia absolutely did try to influence the 2016 election. They weren't particularly successful at doing so, and I don't think they were decisive in the outcome of that election. I think that's fairly clear. But nevertheless, they were attempting to interfere in American democracy, and that was pretty much a slam dunk case, really. But then Trump comes out in 2018 and says, well, actually, I think I believe Putin and I don't believe my intelligence agencies, which is an astounding thing for any American president to say publicly, I think. And so that sense in which Trump has always been eager to push back or to push the United States intelligence community, keep them off balance, essentially, I think has consistently been there in his first term. I think it's accelerated in his second term, and largely, I think, because he feels politically emboldened. So if we think about Trump, I think here the important point to make is I don't think he's singling out just intelligence. So this isn't a specifically intelligence issue. It's an issue about Trump trying to pull every lever of the US Constitution to maximize his scope for maneuver, to strip away any constraints he feels on his power and the power of the presidency. So we think about the pressure he's put on the United States Supreme Court. We think about his recent decision to remove, a really well-respected statistician from the head of the Bureau of Statistics to over job numbers issues. So Trump, really, anyone who challenges Trump's power or questions his judgment, I think he's going after and targeting, really. And the US intelligence community, because its mandate is to speak truth to power and to not be politicized, Trump regards that as disloyalty. So it's a cultural issue, I think, and a psychological issue with Donald Trump, and that he can't understand why the intelligence community would want to give him the unvarnished truth, even if it's unpalatable, and even if it challenges his foreign policy in certain respects. And the intelligence community is bemused why a president wouldn't want to hear the unvarnished truth. So this notion that if you tell me something I don't want to hear, you're being disloyal, I think is really problematic. And recently J.D. Vance came out with a really, I think, instructive statement about the psychology of MAGA and the psychology of the Trump administration. And that was when he was challenged particularly on Iran and the recent Iran bombing and the fact that the intelligence community appears to be put under undue pressure to change its perspective on Iran's nuclear program. And J.D. Vance said, well, I'm not saying that we don't trust the American intelligence community. We just trust our instincts more. So it's almost this sense that we think we're right, and we want you to say the same sort of thing, even if all the evidence and all the collection, all of the analysis from the intelligence community points in the opposite direction. There's this psychological block which Trump just feels the agency is being disloyal if it doesn't produce intelligence that actually sits very neatly with his own conception of American foreign policy and priorities. And I think you look at that and you think, wow, that's amazing. That's just incredible for a president to do that. But again, I don't think it's unprecedented. If you go back to Richard Nixon in the 1970s, the early 1970s, Nixon was doing exactly the same thing. Nixon was putting pressure on the CIA and its leadership to make sure that they were producing intelligence estimates that fitted in with Nixon's foreign policy. And where they didn't, he sacked CIA chief. He put James Schlesinger famously was appointed Director of Central Intelligence in 1973. Schlesinger had no intelligence background. His only qualification for the post is he would do whatever Nixon told him to do. And it was a disastrous appointment for the Central Intelligence. It was deeply unpopular. Morale in the CIA plummeted. The effectiveness of the agency under Schlesinger's term was really impacted in negative ways. But presidents, I think, if they feel that the CIA is being disloyal, and I think Nixon and Trump, although they're very different characters from different backgrounds, also have that sort of that common thread of paranoia about deep state. I think presidents will act to sort of try and constrain the Central Intelligence Agency. So in many ways, Trump is aping what Richard Nixon did back in the 1970s. And I think that didn't end well then. I suspect it won't end well now. So yeah, it's troubling times, I think.
So, two interesting aspects which you mentioned is first is the morale aspect of it, right? About how it impacts morale. Second is when you mentioned Nixon and you compared it to Trump. If you look at it today, there are far more intelligence agencies in play than what was in the Nixon era. And intelligence has a more stronger role in foreign policy in that sense. So, when we keep this in mind, I want to ask you, we also discussed about in the beginning of the podcast about the overall structure of this intelligence community, about how its structure is not based on coordination and cooperation and rather on more checks and balances kind of inter-service rivalry kind of situation, right? So my question mainly here is, does Trump impacting the morale of certain intelligence communities positively benefit the other intelligence communities to actually be more emboldened or come forward in their operations? Or does it also incentivize certain intelligence agencies that have not been touched by this to be more loyal towards Trump in that sense? So does this also create a pro-Trump and anti-Trump faction within the intelligence community as well?
I think it can do that. I think it can be polarizing. And I think once a president is clear that how agencies are treated in terms of budget, in terms of the attention they get from the presidency, and any intelligence agency will tell you, that their apex consumer, their primary consumer is always the president of the United States. And at certain points, the CIA has had poor relations with presidents of the United States. And it's when that happens during that time period, morale in the agency sinks because everyone knows they're being marginalized. So unless they have the ear of the president, unless the president is willing to listen to them, then the whole raison d'etre sort of collapses, really. And because he's the principal customer and the only real customer that the CIA are interested in, that relationship is incredibly important. And I think we then get to the sense where if the president's saying, look, I don't trust the CIA, I don't want to hear from the CIA, and Trump notoriously has been very reluctant to have presidential daily briefings in the CIA, he's been very reluctant to listen to officials in the agency. That does have a massive effect on morale, I think. And I think we can see that with the number of people. The CIA launched a sort of voluntary redundancy program in 2025, in February this year, I think. And it's been overwhelmed with senior CIA officials wanting to take up voluntary redundancy. Now, Trump will argue, well, that's great because under the DOGE system, I want to cut back on bureaucracy in the US government. It's bloated, it's too big, it's inefficient. Some of which is undoubtedly true. Bureaucracies do get too big, they do get bloated. But he's losing some of the key officials that have tremendous amounts of experience on China, on Russia, on really important areas of the world. Those intelligence officers saying, look, I don't want to be put under this political pressure. I'm going to leave and seek. And I think one of the big changes in the past is it's traditionally been quite difficult for intelligence officials, and they haven't been particularly good at it, to move from the state system of intelligence into the private sector. Over the last 10 or 20 years, the private sector intelligence has absolutely exploded, and it's a booming market. So people are falling over themselves in the private sector to say to really experienced and capable CIA officers, absolutely leave the agency, come to us, we will pay you a lot more than you're earning at the Central Intelligence Agency. You won't be subject to the same politicalization or stress you're experiencing at the CIA. So quite a lot of them are jumping ship and moving into the private sector, I think, which is quite worrying, because that sort of denudes the American intelligence capability, I think. Again, if we're drawing historical parallels, I think a really instructive one is to go back to the 1950s. And we look at the sort of anti-communist hysteria in the United States in the 1950s under McCarthyism, when Senator Joseph McCarthy in the Senate was whipping up this hysteria that the State Department and intelligence agencies in the United States were being subverted by this internal communist conspiracy. And lots of really experienced people, particularly with expertise on China, following the PRC's sort of inauguration in October 1949, were sacked by the State Department or sacked by intelligence agencies because they were deemed suspect. That ripped the core out of experience and knowledge that the United States had on China. And so American intelligence sort of went dark on China during a really important period of its interaction with the People's Republic of China. And I think America needs to be really careful it doesn't make the same mistake, that it sort of strips out that deep knowledge that experienced CIA officers have garnered on Russia, on China, on the big adversaries for the United States, essentially. And they leave themselves really struggling to fill those gaps in experience and knowledge. I think that's something that's really worrying. And I know, having spoken to some CIA people, that's really worrying in terms of their morale, that they feel as though the agency's being hollowed out to some extent by the Trump administration. Again, I'd emphasize this isn't just picking on intelligence. Trump's doing it pretty much across the board with many different departments in the American sort of bureaucracy. So, but yeah, it's worrying, I think, in that respect about where that leaves American intelligence, particularly at a time when it's facing existential threats from China, less so from Russia, although Russia is still a threat to European security, I think. But China is America's big adversary, I think, in the 21st century. Even the Trump administration acknowledges that. Lots of things coming out from Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, about China being the big threat to the United States. So is Trump sort of weakening American intelligence at a point when really it needs to be strengthened, particularly looking at China, looking at East Asia? And, we will probably get on to this later, but particularly when India is potentially such an important ally of the United States, when it comes to how do you deal with China? How do you deal with the problem of China in the 21st century? Well, even the United States, I think, will struggle to deal with that without allies. So it needs really powerful allies within the Quad, within India, with other allies who are willing to focus on that threat in Indo-Pacific coming from China. So yeah, in that sense, it's concerning, I think.
So, again, when you mentioned about, this angle of Trump not singling out intelligence community as a whole, can we also say that attacking intelligence community has been more overt as compared to something, say, like State Department alone, or, other departments attacks on education, or that kind of departments, because they're not cool enough as compared to intelligence community, which is seen as the holy grail of conspiracy theories for the mother crowd, right? So also when we keep that in mind, one main question I want to quickly address also is that the ongoing trade negotiations, right? Most of these trade negotiations are not exactly going through. Even the big ones that have been signed with the EU, EU is reconsidering strongly on several aspects of it. They're not happy with it. Similar with China, which has a 90-day pause going on. There are a lot of negotiations in the background. India's negotiations are more or less stalled and they're trying to restart it. There's a lot of controversy on that as well. So all the major US trade partners in that sense are having this kind of struggle, right? Another important element within these trade negotiations has also been strategic component, because they have not only been restricted to things that are trade alone, but they're also bringing in, different kinds of more strategic inputs in that sense, right? So do you think US intelligence community moving away from the Trump administration in that sense is also causing the unwanted stress on these trade negotiations, due to a sense of lack of information and overindulgence of strategic affairs with trade as a component?
Yeah, some really good questions, Abhishek, actually. I think when it comes to why Trump might be targeting intelligence publicly in ways he isn't targeting, as you said, educational, he's targeting finance, interesting. The poor head of the Federal Reserve is coming in for quite a lot of public criticism from Donald Trump recently. And I think in both those circumstances, when we think about finance, and particularly the Federal Reserve, and when we think about intelligence, I think the reasons they draw so much of Trump's public ire rather than his private ire is I think he thinks that by manipulating both of those sectors, the market sector and finance and intelligence, he can get really big wins that resonate with his base, his MAGA base. So, for example, bombing Iran was really important to Trump because it's like, look, I'm a man of action. I've seen a threat to a region that's really important to the United States. I've taken decisive action, and it's been a tremendous success. And when he gets that narrative challenged by the American intelligence community, and they say, well, hold on a second, let's really judge how successful or impactful that attack by the United States was. When that narrative is challenged, he doesn't like it because it's sort of stripping away, I think, two reasons, really. One, he knows the impact it will have on his foreign standing. So he doesn't like the fact that his own intelligence agencies are contradicting him in public or potentially exposing him to humiliation in terms of allies. And also just he's incredibly thin-skinned as an individual. I think we think about Donald Trump, he doesn't like criticism. He doesn't like taking criticism in any way. And he wants to project this impression of being infallible, I think, in his actions. So particularly when certain sections of the American intelligence community questioned or tried to qualify even just the extent to which those bombing raids by the United States have been successful in retarding Iran's nuclear program, suggesting that, they hadn't really hit the enriched uranium that Iran was storing. They probably retarded the program by months rather than years. That was really problematic for Donald Trump. So I think it's the extent to which the intelligence community can garner huge international headlines in ways that American education simply can't. No one really in the international community cares about American education. It's so parochial, it's a domestic issue. But when intelligence comment on something really strategically important to the globe, everyone sits up and listens. So Trump really, I think, is acutely aware and conscious of the fact that he wants to get intelligence on his side to reinforce a narrative rather than to challenge it. So I think that's an issue. And it's the same with finance. The notion that once America sneezes, if America's banking system, financial system's got a cold and it sneezes, then the rest of the world catches that cold because it's so influential globally. So Trump is absolutely convinced that the Federal Reserve isn't on his side at the moment. So he's putting tremendous pressure on them because it's important for him in terms of his international relations. I think that carries over in terms of free trade as well. I think free trade, without a doubt, Trump is using intelligence and using American foreign policy as a lever to squeeze people on economics. So I think India will be a classic example of this, I think. Modi had a great relationship with Trump. They seem to get on really, really well. There seems to be a personal chemistry between them. And I think many commentators fell into the trap that India's okay because they get on really well together. But I think Trump doesn't have friends. He doesn't, he has, it's that classic sort of, that saying that, we don't really have, we have friends. We have sort of, this notion that you're going to be friends with Trump is not going to hold sway really. So I think Trump is deliberately, for example, at the moment, pivoting towards Pakistan, saying nice things about Pakistan, criticizing Modi, emphasizing the extent to which he did or didn't become involved in mediation following Operation Sindoor. So this notion that he's sort of squeezing the Modi administration really on foreign policy and on intelligence-related issues to try and get what he wants in terms of a free trade agreement, try and get what he wants in terms of economics is really important. I think that matters for Modi as well, because Modi is nothing like Donald Trump, and I wouldn't suggest he was. But both of them present an image of being domestically sort of strong men, domestically people who can control their own sort of polities at home. And when Trump is sort of throwing out invective at Narendra Modi, that obviously doesn't play well domestically in India. So I think there is a sense in which Trump is definitely trying to weaponize intelligence and weaponize foreign policy more generally, and particularly going back to this notion of trying to drive a wedge between India and the United States by using Pakistan is problematic, I think. So you can sort of see that the connections between the two, between Trump and using intelligence as a weapon, I think, which is, again, many people in the intelligence community are deeply uncomfortable with.
But my question also was, also in relation to why these deals are falling apart or not materializing, right? Can we say a lack of intelligence or intelligence community is growing distance? Like you mentioned about how experts are, moving away from Washington to more private roles, or just probably distancing themselves from the administration alone to, they sit out the storm kind of situation, right? So does this distance also correlate in a sense that these deals are not backed by enough information about the people involved, or, the situations around and things like that? Because we also see a lack of knowledge about, how these countries operate. For example, US-India trade relations, they were constantly criticized as US not understanding what India actually is or what India wants in terms of this trade deal not materialized, right? So
I think that's right. I think there is a sense in which there's a huge amount of expertise in certain think tanks in Washington that relates to India. So there's expertise outside of government, which I think is really strong. So certain think tanks, Brookings, for example, have got a very good relationship with, or very good reputation for being quite sophisticated in their approach to the United States and India. I don't think they've got much of a voice in Washington. I think that's the problem now. I think inside the administration, other voices are taking over that are more powerful, and they're marginalizing more nuanced and informed opinion on how United States should engage with India and how it should seek to do a deal with India, really. So I think Trump's administration haven't got India experts, I think, that really understand the country or even want to understand India. So this notion of having a lack of depth in terms of their engagement with India culturally, historically, in terms of what's worked well, in terms of managing that relationship before. And, India's relationship with the United States has always been really bumpy. It's always been up and down. It's been through periods of great tension. It's always been through periods where it's worked very, very well, particularly under Bush, for Bush 1, for example. So there have been periods of change. But I think at the moment there is a slight concern that America isn't really engaging with India in ways that are productive, and is engaging in such a way that is creating real problems for India. Although I think India wants to have a really good, strong relationship with the United States in security terms and economic terms, there's a lack of understanding, I think, culturally or politically, over why India is taking the stances it has. So we're almost back to this, you're either with me or against me strategy, post 9/11, which obviously is never going to sit well with India. India's whole strategic posture has always been about maintaining sort of multipolarity, has always been very cognizant of the fact that it has very strong security and intelligence and economic interests with other states in the region that the United States may be more less aligned with. We think about Russia and Russian energy, but also Russian security and military supplies to India, but even Iran and other countries where India has a clear raison d'etre for maintaining constructive relations with those countries. And the United States' sort of unwillingness or inability or refusal to recognize those fundamental truths, I think, is really problematic. So we're going back to a very binary approach by the United States, which doesn't really take into account the tensions and the stresses on India and its need to maintain a sense of autonomy, strategic autonomy, economic autonomy. There's this lack of realization that India does not want to become a pseudo state of the United States of America. It wants to have a really strong, robust sense of economic independence or political independence, of strategic independence. And it will work with allies like the United States, but only where it feels as though that sort of independence and autonomy is not being compromised to levels that are unacceptable to India. So I think there is that sort of lack of that sense of nuanced strategic appreciation of why India is acting in the way it is, and that's deeply ingrained in the Indian political psyche. I mean, Ashley Tellis's article, which I'm sure you've seen in Foreign Affairs recently, which basically essentially calls for India to become a sort of an ally of the United States and completely align with the United States. In many ways, I guess you could argue that Talis is making a realpolitik argument for India taking a side, particularly in relation to China. This notion that India is never going to be able to contain China unless it gets on the right side of the United States. Now, there is some validity in that argument, but it seems to completely ignore the fact that this is really going to be problematic for India in terms of its economic alternative, just in terms of its political culture. So there's this sort of sense, I think, coming out of Washington, that a frustration with India, but born of a complete misunderstanding of how India has operated really since 1947 onwards. So, yeah, I think it is problematic, and I don't know the short-term solution to that really. I hope some more nuanced voices in Washington will gain more traction over the coming months and coming years, but at the moment that doesn't seem to be the case. So yes, it's an interesting time we're in, I think.
Definitely. And it's also an interesting time because, you mentioned regularly about how, India also views US in more for security and strategic terms, and also economic, obviously. So it's also interesting times because these, for at least the past 2 years, have been a time where US and India have always come in some kinds of a crossroads in their relationships, especially in terms of intelligence. First is the entire controversy that went on with India and Khalistani movement in Canada and the alleged assassination attempts, followed by the alleged US involvement in the Bangladeshi regime change, essentially. And today we have the entire Operation Sindoor going on. Pakistan and US developing a closer ties is also happening in the background. So, and each of these incidences, which have been the core aspects of US-India tensions, have been rooted in US intelligence community, right? Because trade, in essence, has been running in the background since the start, and the concerns have been same, but it has not expanded to this scale where there is some kind of a boundary broken between the strategic affairs of alliances and that kind of thing used against the trade policy. So my question here primarily is, what kind of relationship does US intelligence community have within the intelligence community today? And do you think US intelligence community is behind US's change in direction towards India?
So I think intelligence has been really interesting because I think it offers hope for the future of Indo-US relations. And I think that might sound odd to some of your listeners, but I think if you go back historically and think, as we mentioned before, India's been through some real quite large ups and downs in its relationship with the United States. It's been a really roller coaster relationship. At certain points, the relationship's been in really deep trouble. And at other points, it's been really quite constructive and for both sides. I think if we're going to draw a line between those peaks and those troughs of America's relationship with India since 1947, the one constant line, which really doesn't go up too much and doesn't come down too much, it goes up and down a bit, but not to the same extent as the general relationship, is intelligence. So I'll give you an example. In 1971, when the Nixon administration tilted decisively to Pakistan and tried to prevent India facilitating or at least helping the creation of the independent nation state of Bangladesh, it's an nadir, an absolute low for American relations with India. They were at rock bottom in 1971. But still, the intelligence back channels between India and the United States remained relatively good. So the Nixon administration Indira Gandhi's administration was an anathema to Nixon at that time, but information flows and intelligence flows were still passing backwards and forwards between Indian intelligence and American intelligence, even during the height of the 1971 conflict. And I've spoken to diplomats in the United States who were serving India at the time, and they said, it was no surprise to us that even though politically we weren't talking to our Indian counterparts, that in foreign policy terms, the relationship was just dead. In intelligence terms, it was still very much live and active during that period. So intelligence was able to sort of, weather those political storms in ways that formal diplomacy really couldn't do. I think that's been the case really throughout the whole tenure of the United States relationship with India, even when it's at a real low. India and America both recognize the real importance in national security terms, I think, of two things. One is China, absolutely. China is absolutely the common thread that keeps intelligence between India and the United States together, because they both represent existential threats to both of those nation states. So who's going to be the existential threat to the United States in the 21st century? It will only be the People's Republic of China, economically, strategically, in all sorts of ways. What's going to be the big existential threat potentially to India? It will only be the People's Republic of China. So those two two threads are tying India together. I think the other thing is counterterrorism, as you mentioned, and that both sets of nations really see a huge benefit in working together constructively on counterterrorism and international terrorism. And I think that was just emphasized by 2008 in Mumbai when the FBI, the CIA supplied India with a huge amount of intelligence on what was going on, after 2008. So I think there is a sense in which the United States recognizes that sort of counterterrorism link is incredibly important moving forward. And that won't change, I think, and won't shift. And I think a good example of that, you mentioned Khalistan. And if we go back to sort of the alleged, and I will use the word alleged, state-sponsored assassinations that were linked back to Indian intelligence, and particularly research analysis wing, that are happening in British Columbia in Canada, and the attempted assassination of Panam that happened in Manhattan in the United States. Very, very different reactions between the Canadian government and the United States government to those two, one successful assassination, one alleged attempted assassination. And I think that spoke to just generally the importance of the security and intelligence relationship the United States attaches to India, and how Canada does not have that same level of importance. So Justin Trudeau coming out criticizing India in public, in Parliament, quite strident. We get Indian diplomats sent home from Ottawa, expelled from New Delhi. It's a real diplomatic disaster for the two countries. And intelligence is at the very heart of that. The Biden administration handles it very differently. Very low key, very little criticism of India, working through the American legal system and the courts, not trying to make this a diplomatic issue between two countries. I think that really stems from the Biden administration, and to some extent the Trump administration, I think, follows that policy. Recognizes that it cannot really afford to break its intelligence and security connection with India. It's just too important a country in too important a region when we think about China, and also we think about counterterrorism. So the United States, I think that episode was instructive in what it told us, not so much about state-sponsored assassination, which seems to be gaining traction in the international community, but what it told us about the underlying security and intelligence relationship between the two states, which I think is a lot stronger and a lot more durable than people give it credit for often. I think that relationship between Indian intelligence organs and the United States has really been very solid for a number of decades now. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So despite Trump throwing barbs at Modi about the Indian economy and acting in petulant and silly ways in public, I think the intelligence communities realize that fundamentally they need to make sure that relationship functions effectively. And interestingly, and if you go back to the MAGA base and the Heritage Foundation and people that are really loyal to Trump, I mean, the 2025 project, which really came out of the Heritage Foundation, other right-wing think tanks in the United States, if you read through their documentation, at the core of that is putting India at the really heart of American security and intelligence sort of strategy into the 21st century. So part of the Heritage Foundation Project 2025 is not to diminish intelligence and security connections with India, but to grow them and to make them deeper and stronger, because their focus is absolutely on China. So one of the surprising, I don't think this will actually happen, but it's interesting that some of the 2025 documentation really focuses on the Quad and says we should actually ramp up our intelligence and security support for the Quad. We should get much better intelligence cooperation with India. We should develop this. I don't think the Trump administration is really taking that forward, but it sort of speaks to his right-wing base and why they think India is a really important potential ally for the United States moving forward. So we're going to have these bumps in the road over free trade and all that sort of stuff. And Trump seems to be determined to alienate everyone, I think, in the global community over trade. I don't think he's particularly picking on India in that sense. But I think intelligence and security might be one of the things we can point to more optimistically in terms of a common thread that won't be irreparably damaged by what's going on at the moment in terms of Trump's free trade.
So that's a very important point which you made, right? So two quick, I guess, final questions in this regard is, first is this the case despite the new Pakistan factor, or the revival of Pakistani factor in Indo-US relationships? Because Pakistani factor undoubtedly comes with the intelligence angle attached to it, because Pakistan's entire policy is led by its intelligence communities. Then I also have the question of people of Indian diaspora being extensively involved in, U.S. intelligence community right now, be it Kash Patel, be it Tulsi Gabbard, and, the other associated larger people in the Trump administration who also come from Indian origin and also are generally pro-India in that sense. Do you think that impacts the Indo-US relations?
Yeah, I think on the Pakistan thing, I think Trump is using Pakistan at the moment as a lever to put pressure on the Modi administration in India. I think there's no doubt about that. I think the United States, in intelligence and security terms, the American intelligence community is still quite scarred by what happened after 9/11 and what happened with ISI and the extent to which they were played by ISI. And I think that's playing out both in institutional terms, and I think there are still people, I mean, we mentioned the hollowing out of the US intelligence community, but there are still enough grizzled CIA and NSA and FBI officers who have been scarred by their relationship with Pakistan after 9/11 and the extent to which they felt that they were, that relationship was being abused by the Pakistani state for their own purposes. I think that's still there. I think that skepticism, that cynicism about the extent to which the United States can work effectively with Pakistan in the long term is still very much there. So it's like, these guys are always going to let us down at some point. It's just a question of when. So I think that's still very much there within the intelligence community. I think, interestingly, in popular culture terms, that's going to have an impact as well. So you may have seen that Tim Bine has just published his second book on the Central Intelligence Agency, which is a sort of he published Legacy about Ashes a number of years ago, which looked at the early years of the CIA. His latest book is looking at the CIA in the 21st century. That is really critical of the CIA and Pakistan and ISI. And I think that's going to filter into, again, sort of American sort of popular culture and public consciousness as well, about reminding people about really what happened back then, why it happened, how it played out, how it didn't play out to the United States' advantage. They're going to rake over bin Laden and about Abbottabad, and all those sort of things are going to come up again. And it's going to be really difficult for the Trump administration not to take that on board, I think, in terms of reminding people exactly what happened, after 9/11. So I think, although he's using Pakistan at the moment, I don't know how long the Trump administration's patience with Pakistan is going to last, particularly if there's another incident like Pahalgam, or there's another terrorist atrocity that occurs. I think the Trump administration patience with Pakistan using that type of asymmetric warfare in a way that's really dangerous in terms of its escalatory potential in South Asia, both states in nuclear arms, all that. I think that will wear thin pretty quickly. So that'll be interesting, I think, how that plays out. In terms of South Asian diaspora and how that plays out in the United States, I don't think it makes a big difference in terms of specific individuals in the Trump administration, although they are occupying prominent positions, as you said. Tulsi Gabbard and others, Kash Patel, are influential within the Trump administration and regarded as real Trump loyalists. I think more generally, Trump really regards the South Asian base in the United States, and particularly the Indian base, as loyal allies. So I think, I think Trump is more minded, or might be more minded, to take a more sympathetic approach to India, because he really sees South Asians as his type of people. So I think there's people who have been quite supportive of Trump. There's obviously been quite supportive of Narendra Modi when it comes to the United States as well. But it's like Trump's kind of people, like entrepreneurial, business orientated, quite sort of outspoken in their patriotism towards the United States. So, quite outspoken in terms of counterterrorism and how they would approach that sort of thing. So it's a group, it's a community, I think, although traditionally they've sort of tilted towards the Democrats, are now becoming much more Republican in their focus. And they seem to be sort of, ticking the boxes where Trump thinks, these are my kind of guys, really. So I think generally South Asians, political sway in the United States, and as well as the population grows and they become very influential in states like Texas, are becoming, really something that Trump's listening to. So I don't think individuals make a difference, but I think the demographics of the United States in terms of domestic politics are going to make the South Asian diaspora more and more powerful over time. And I think Trump's savvy enough to understand and recognize that and to want to reflect it.
Thank you so much for your strong insights, Professor McGarr. It was a really a great pleasure having you with our podcast here. And we hope to see you again soon with our podcast sometime later in the future. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Always great to talk to you. Thank you very much. And really great to get your knowledgeable insights as well. So yeah, I'd love to come back on the podcast anytime you'll have me. And thank you for today. I really enjoyed it.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.